Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to this quick little review on Frostpunk 2. A game I was playing on stream last week and very much so enjoyed, as in my eyes it is one of the rarest of beasts these days. A sequel that does not merely complement the prequel, that does not merely add a little thing here and there or polish up some UI elements in the name of accessibility, but rather a sequel that improves and expands upon virtually every single element of its predecessor. But I must immediately add in one caveat to that otherwise profusive praise, because there is one thing that the game has not improved or expanded upon, but rather, in fact, relegated to a supporting role and downgraded quite severely, and that is the people in Frostpunk 2. Now, this might be something that is either an absolute deal-breaker for you, or as for me, virtual irrelevancy, which is why it is important to get it out of the way early. See, Frostpunk 1, as far as city builders were concerned, was a relatively simplistic game where you had a relatively small area to operate in, and you had relatively predetermined areas that you could build in, radiating out from the city and so on, right? But what Frostpunk did to weigh up for its somewhat limited scope was to focus heavily on the human aspect of the game. This, incidentally, in case you are unaware, comes from the same developers of This War of Mine, another game that focused heavily on the narrative aspect of the game. The narrative of Frostpunk, of course, was that you are civilization's last hope. The cold is coming, and if you cannot save the remnants of humanity, humanity may very well be simply wiped out. And to make that narrative more gamey, it then adds in a moral component by asking you to make choices. What is the survival of humanity worth to you? Will you force children to work in the mines, despite the knowledge that they may be maimed or killed? Will you force workers to enter an environment in the deep mines that will guaranteeably kill them just in order to maintain the flow of coal? Will you abuse prisoners, beat and torture them in order to force them as well to work for the collective? And how will you make sure that everybody listens to you? Will you ply them with that most ancient of all of opiates, religion? Or will you create a religion of order instead, of totalitarian authority? And as you continue through the game and you make these choices, your city visibly changes with banners or religious icons. And the people who die, well, they get little death certificates. They have their names recorded. It is not merely Citizen A out of 2,347 that has expired today. It is Bob, Linda, Wilfred, and Clark. The developers themselves said it very poignantly when they described Frostpunk 1 as a societal survival game. As even if humanity survives, our society might not. And this is the part where we return to Frostpunk 2. Frostpunk 2, of course, takes place on a much grander scale. You are zoomed out. The original city is merely the central hub, as the rest of your city sprawls out from beyond it. You are now dealing with a lot more people, and they don't all have names anymore. You are making macro decisions now, rather than the micro decisions of Frostpunk 1. That is not to say that the moral aspects of the game are no longer present, they absolutely are, but they are no longer quite as personal. This is also further pointed out by the fact that you can no longer see the people wandering the streets. Best case, you might see an automaton here or there wandering around on a major road, but your direct connection to the people whose welfare you are charged with protecting, well, it's nowhere near as close any longer. Now, for me, that is not a problem at all. I didn't even notice. It was only after I'd been thinking this review through for a couple of days that I realized it's like, oh yeah, no, that might actually be a serious concern for some people. Because if you originally visited Frostpunk 1 with the interest of the moral decision-making on a personal level, then that is actually something that Frostpunk 2 does not have. And this is, at the end of the day, going to be both a difference in expectations and a difference in immersion, I believe, as well, and what exactly you enjoy and how you enjoy it. See, for me, for example, the majority of the moral quandaries, whether it be in Frostpunk 1 or 2, were utterly and completely banal, honestly. For example, in Frostpunk 2, you get an event chain that asks, we have a way to get more coal out of the mines. 15% more coal if we take the children, we have them work in the mines, and we have them crawl into the various creeks and crevices to fetch out the last few dregs of coal. But it could be dangerous. And, well, my only reaction to that really is, oh, you don't say. Having children work in a coal mine at minus 30 degrees Celsius could be dangerous, could it? Well, shit. I had no idea. Anywho, ship them off to the mines immediately. This is then followed by another event where the mine is on fire, and you've got the choice between either closing off the mine, saving the rest of the coal, but also killing the children in the process, or sacrificing the rest of the coal to save the children. And yet again, I do not need a second of consideration over this decision. Kill the children! Kill the children now! And this too, I will point out, is not merely a decision I am comfortable with making purely because it is a video game. That makes it easier, don't get me wrong. But this is a decision I am more than happy to stand by and defend in reality as well. Okay, 200 children died. Boo-hoo. It saved the lives of thousands of others, tens of thousands. It saved the lives of the last glimmering remnant of civilizational humanity in the wasteland. I will sacrifice a lot of children on that altar. And then, to the game's credit, there is even a third event, where one of the surviving family members of the dead children say that at least they did not die in vain, because at least the city still has heat. And that is where the divide comes in. See, for me, if we are in an extreme situation like this, the survival of the species is hanging in the balance, then yes, I am willing to sacrifice quite literally any number of children to secure that survival. You know, up until the point where the human species is simply wiped out, I suppose, but you get my drift. To me, that is not a difficult moral choice, it is an extraordinarily simple one. In fact, it took me many times longer to decide on a question of economy and taxation than it did to sacrifice the children. And I know that sounds terrible, but that is exactly the thing. The question of economy was, do we give everyone the same rations, the same food, the same essentials, the same clothes, the same soaps, etc.? Or do we institute a monetary system of wages, where we then prize goods to be paid for in heat stamps, so that a foreman will earn more than a worker, a factory overhead will earn more than the foreman, and thus the higher up on the hierarchy you are, the more essentials and luxuries you can afford? This is actually a far more complex moral quandary, because the survival of the species is not at stake here. This is a question about fairness, what is and is not right, because we are all in this together, we are all desperate for survival, so surely we should all share in the same resources, right? But at the same time, all of our efforts are not equal. The efforts of a highly trained specialist should be valued more greatly than a random grunt labourer. Furthermore, a grunt labourer that works more, better, and more efficiently than another labourer should be rewarded with more currency than the lazy one. Or as the Japanese is so fond of saying, Hataraku bekarasu ku bekarasu. He who does not work does not eat. I eventually went for the wage solution, and then, beautifully enough, an event popped up saying, okay, those who work are getting paid, but what about everybody else? Those who are currently unemployed, who simply don't have a job to go to, what about them? Should they simply starve? And then I can go, oh no, obviously of course not, because now we can combine the best of both worlds. There will be basic rations for everyone. There will simply be greater rations and more variety in choice in rations for those who do work. A perfect solution. But again, that's me. Whereas somebody who is more empathetic might actually look at the problem with the children and think, okay, I am willing to save the coal mine to save the children. And if you are that kind of player, then Frostpunk 2 is not going to be an improvement. It is in fact going to be a serious downgrade. Right. I've spent like 10 minutes on this thing now, but I do think it is a very important and major distinction between the two games that deserves expanding upon. Plus, it's an interesting question of how people view the world, which, by the way, we're going to do another video on in a moment or two. But returning to the point of Frostpunk 2, once we've gotten across this major divide, which will absolutely make or break you on the game, let's look at the rest of the game, shall we? So, Frostpunk 2, obviously, is a survival city builder, where you are put in charge of humanity's, maybe, last hope? Well, the wasteland is far more heavily populated than you might have thought, frankly. And you need to make some difficult decisions to make sure that everybody has enough food, everybody has enough heat, and that you have all of the various resources you require to keep your city functional, even as the temperature goes up and down. Because at the end of the day, what I'm looking for in Frostpunk 2 is in essence a city builder with a threat mechanic. And that threat mechanic is the cold. The cold can grow more severe, which increases the quantity of heat you are required to produce, which will quickly start reducing your stockpiles of coal or oil. And occasionally, whiteout conditions will happen, which will drastically increase the need for heating and also make it far more difficult to grow food, making it necessary for you to have planned quite a bit ahead, to the point where your city can survive a long period of being snowed in, of having its resources slowly, or sometimes very quickly, eaten away at by circumstance. To make sure that you get this stockpile, you of course build buildings. These buildings can either be on the map itself, the main city, or they can be found in a couple of colonies that you establish. Oil, for example, in the campaign comes from one such colony that provides your city with all the fuel oil it needs to stay warm. Hopefully. This in turn will require the expanding of not just the buildings getting you the oil, but also the logistical network between the colony and the city. As whilst you might be more than happy with say 120 oil to begin with, when the temperature gauge simply begins to read "pray," you're gonna need a hell of a lot more oil. And this then leads you to the research tree, where you can research outright new buildings, or more often various upgrades to buildings. These upgrades in turn are preferred by some and disliked by others based upon your city's primary values, which can be things like progress, technology, or tradition. These are values that are held by factions within your city. These factions could, for example, be religious, traditionalist, mechanical, etc., or even almost primitivist, where they argue that the only way to conquer the cold is to get used to it, to embrace it and do whatever is necessary to repopulate the frozen wasteland. And so, when you're looking at a new technology, you might have 2 or 3 options, which have slight variations. For example, one upgrade might produce a little bit more heat, but require a bit more workers to operate it. And this then might be favoured by the Frostlanders, who believe that, okay, maximizing heat is good, and if we've got to throw a couple more bodies at it, so what? But the mechanists will then look at that and say, that's an enormous waste. Of course we can mechanize this thing, and so it produces a little less heat, but it requires a lot less people to operate it. These simple trade-offs are fairly basic in and of themselves, and honestly, with the size of your city eventually, throwing a couple more bodies at a thing is really genuinely not a problem whatsoever. But this then leads us into the most intriguing aspect of the game, the politicking, as these various factions will argue against one another, and eventually against you. And if you wish to institute sweeping reforms, like, say for example, instituting apprenticeship, so that all children must learn the professions of their fathers, then you need to actually pass that in the Senate, which is made up of a series of representatives who are elected by the various political parties depending upon their influence in the city. So, if you want something that, say, the mechanists really want, the religious people are ambivalent towards, the Frostlanders really hate, and the evolutionaries really hate, you might need to negotiate with the opposition parties. Maybe you can count on the support of 2 of the factions, because they want it, and maybe that's enough to pass it. Maybe it's not. You can then approach, say, the Frostlanders and say, alright, what do you want? And they will go, we want to be able to determine the next vote. Alright, fair enough, I will promise you that. And now they will vote for you. You can even tell them to vote against things if you really don't want it to pass, even if it has a majority. Of course, this also means that you'll have to actually fulfill your promise, otherwise the faction is going to start disliking you quite a lot. And over the course of a campaign, as countless decisions begin to mount, tensions can grow quite high indeed. And what I really like about this political system is that it avoids one of the largest pitfalls of these systems, where the AI behaves just simply ridiculously, absurdly obstructionist. Take, for example, Rome Total War II, where the more control you have over the Senate, the angrier everybody is with you. Having a large, prosperous, wealthy, successful empire is a point of friction that will actually annoy the other parties. Damn you for allowing us to conquer the world. I'm richer than ever. Our Rome has gone from a single city-state to a globe-spanning nation. I hate you. And then they will also look at the map and go, you have countless armies, an enormous economy, and endless lands. I'm going to revolt against you. Why? Because my AI programming says I will. That's why. And don't get me started on the diplomacy. The very idea that there exists such a thing as a negative modifier for being too powerful is absolutely and utterly nonsensical. So, a tiny little nation looks up at this behemoth nation on its borders that goes, "Hey, you want trade rights?" And they go, "No. You're far too powerful and could crush me like a bug. I refuse your reasonable demand, and fuck you too." It's so insane, and goes against anything even remotely realistic or human. Whereas in Frostpunk 2, you can negotiate with these factions. You can give them things that they want, and they will like you better for it. They will not simply screw you for no reason. They will actually have legitimate grievances by the time when they actually start acting out against you, because they have their own moral convictions. When the Evolvers moved against me in my playthrough, it wasn't because the AI was, "Oh, I really hate you now." It was because at virtually every turn, I had done everything opposite to their interests. The Evolvers really do believe that it is folly to try and pursue heat, to try and create a tiny oasis of heat and prosperity in the wasteland when the rest is going to waste. They believe humanity's only way of survival is to embrace the frost, and thus, in their eyes, my actions is threatening the survival of humanity. Of course, they would rise up against me. Honestly, the political element is probably my favorite feature of Frostpunk 2. My second favorite is the events. So we talked about all of these decisions you make. These decisions might spur future events in the game, where you get a little pop-up saying, "Hey, you've instituted a law that makes it so that everyone needs to become what their fathers were. Well, a smith has come to you now, and he's brought his boy with him, and he's telling you that this boy is poetically gifted. He is not a blacksmith, but he can weave words in a way that could move the masses." And so his father asks that his boy not be made into a smith like him, because he clearly has greater talents in other areas. And you can then make a decision: do you loosen up the laws, which might piss off people, or do you keep them strict and maybe rob yourself of a virtuoso poet? And many of these decisions then have follow-up decisions who tell you about the outcomes of your actions, the human cost, and occasionally, if you've made some good ones, the human benefits of your actions. It really does bring the game far more so to life, and the developers have really sat down and thought these decisions through. There is no empty moralizing here. As I mentioned earlier with the children example, there isn't an event that comes up later that says, "Oh, you condemned the children to death, you mean old grumpy puss you." No, instead there's another one going, "Yeah, I'm sad that my sister is gone. She was our caretaker. She was a great sister, but she sacrificed her life for the city." Okay, that makes sense. Honestly, again, the developers have really done their homework when it comes to morality in this game, which I'm very deeply impressed by. Now, there are some drawbacks as well. See, what else have we got? Soundtrack is very good, I love it. There is no tutorial, but the game is largely intuitive enough and teaches you step by step to the point where you don't really need a holding your hands tutorial. Simply giving you objectives of, hey, build coal mines is usually more than enough. The game runs perfectly well on my system, smoothly, not a single crash, but it does apparently crash quite a lot on MacBook Linux style stuff, so do bear that in mind. And the single largest drawback of the game, in my opinion, is probably replayability. This is a $40 to $50 game, depending upon your local currency and conversion rates, etc., which is not cheap. It's not full $60 price or anything, and it certainly isn't $70, but I beat the game in about 10 to 14 odd hours with a restart, so the entire campaign is not super duper long. There is, however, various game modes as well, where you can play Utopia mode, which is far more of a sandboxy freestyle builder, and it also has several randomized maps that you can explore on as you can venture out into the Frostlands to find survivors, resources, and different colonies. This mode would definitely add another solid amount of hours, and you can also always replay the campaign to favor different factions and get different endings. So if you really enjoy the building aspects, I would imagine that you'd get between 14 to 20 to maybe 30 hours out of the game in total, which is not mind-blowing value for your money in video game terms, but it's not bad either. Though again, I will say that the replayability is limited due to the fact that there isn't a whole lot of different buildings. There isn't that many ways you can play the game successfully. There aren't a whole lot of alternative strategies that will allow you to survive the whiteouts. It's mostly focused around which faction you choose to please and which faction you choose to piss off, which doesn't actually affect your overall play style all that much. There will be some different bonuses, there will be some different upgrade buildings, and there will be some different challenges to deal with. One route might cause more squalor, for example. Another route might cause more diseases, which require differing solutions, but at the end of the day, it's not a big enough change to the point where I would consider it an entirely fresh playthrough. Especially after you've seen most of the events once, as the events really are one of the biggest flavor parts of the game that really hooks you in. But that's of course the problem with scripted events. Once you've seen it, you've seen it. Even so, I am more than happy to heartily recommend Frostpunk. I would give the game, if we are to indulge in arbitrary numbers scoring, a solid 8 out of 10. Mainly dragged down by its relatively limited replayability and its less than amazing bang for bucks. Anyways, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Until next time, have a good day.